The air smelled of rain, thick with the promise of a storm that had already passed. The park bench felt like an island, isolated in the corner of a downtown square. Jackson's fingers gripped the wood tightly, but not with determination. It was more like the last semblance of control he had over the chaos brewing inside him. His military uniform was a patchwork of faded blue and green, stained with the remnants of yesterday's battles. Battles only he remembered. The dull clink of his dog tags against his chest was the only sound that kept him tethered to reality. A few feet away, a jogger zipped by, oblivious to the man sitting on the bench, his gaze fixed on the ground, lost in the heavy weight of his own thoughts. Jackson's right leg twitched. He didn't notice. His mind was elsewhere, replaying memories of dusty desert roads, the sound of helicopters cutting through the air, the sharp tang of gunpowder still lingering in his nostrils. The footsteps of another person, slow and purposeful, approached, snapping him back to the present. He didn't look up, didn't need to. He'd seen enough faces like this one in his life. Veterans who thought their service made them special, who wore their injuries like badges of honor. "Nice day." A voice interrupted his thoughts. Jackson glanced up without moving his head, his eyes briefly scanning the newcomer. A woman, not much older than him but younger than most veterans he knew. She was standing awkwardly on the sidewalk, clearly sizing him up, probably trying to decide if he was someone worth speaking to. He dismissed her instantly. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice harsh. "If you like this sort of weather." She smiled, but it was quick, fleeting, like a reflex she didn't quite believe in. "I do. Been stuck in a few places where it was nothing but sun and dust." Jackson shifted his weight, flexing his knee, the same knee that had been shattered in a firefight 3 years ago. He'd never quite gotten used to the pain, but the pain was his, and it was a constant reminder of the things he had survived, the things he had done. The woman took a step closer and stopped, glancing at the bench. He didn't say anything, didn't offer her the seat, but after a brief hesitation, she sat down anyway. A quiet, self-assured movement that annoyed him, as if she thought she was entitled to space. "Veteran?" she asked. Jackson looked at her, then let his gaze slide away, not out of politeness, but out of disinterest. He wasn't in the mood to talk, wasn't in the mood for anyone who thought they could understand what he'd been through. "Yeah," he muttered, his eyes still on the distant horizon. "Marine. Army?" she replied, her voice calm but edged with something he couldn't quite place. "It's always good to meet another vet." Her tone was steady, almost too steady. It bothered him. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want her to talk. And yet, somehow, she kept going like the kind of person who had learned how to be persistent in the face of disinterest. "So, what was your tour?" she asked, glancing at his leg. Jackson clenched his jaw. "Afghanistan. Few other places," he said quickly, hoping she'd drop it. She didn't. "Was it hard?" she asked. "Being over there?" He turned his head sharply, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were dark, filled with years of anger and resentment. "You think I'm gonna tell you my life story?" he snapped. "I don't know you, and I don't owe you shit." Her eyebrows raised slightly, a faint glimmer of surprise flashing in her eyes, but she didn't flinch. "I wasn't asking for a story, just wondering if you were okay." Jackson scoffed, feeling the sting of his own words, even as they left his mouth. It wasn't about her. It was about the way people always assumed they could see the wounds. He'd been asked that question more times than he could count. "I'm fine. I'm always fine." She stared at him for a long moment. Jackson could feel the weight of her eyes on him, but he refused to meet them again. He had said his piece. He wasn't in the mood for pleasantries, or for anyone trying to play therapist. "I don't believe you," she said quietly. Her words hit him harder than anything he'd heard in a long time. Jackson's face twisted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. His pulse quickened, and the sharp sting of his old injuries flared up, making him wince. But he kept his posture rigid. He had been in enough confrontations to know that losing his temper wouldn't get him anywhere. He had learned to keep his rage contained, like a beast in a cage, just barely out of reach. But this woman was testing him. "You don't know shit about me," he spat, his voice cold and biting. "You have no idea what it's like, walking around like this, pretending everything's okay." She blinked, but her face remained calm. "No, I don't. But I know what it's like to keep pretending." There was a beat of silence. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't say anything more. He didn't know how to respond. The words she had said felt like an accusation, but not one meant to hurt. More like an invitation, a challenge. He could feel his face redden, a hot flush of shame creeping up his neck. He didn't want to feel anything. He wanted to shut it all out. But she was right. She had seen him, really seen him. "So, what now?" he muttered, trying to deflect, trying to regain control. "You gonna sit here and judge me?" Her eyes softened. There was something almost imperceptible about the way she looked at him. Not pity, not superiority, but understanding. "I'm not judging you, Jackson. I'm just trying to make sure you don't forget you're still alive." Jackson's mouth went dry. He wasn't used to anyone speaking to him like that. Like he mattered. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this, not so clearly. He didn't want to admit it, but his chest felt tight. The rawness of her words caught him off guard. He wanted to yell, to scream, to push her away. But something in her steady gaze kept him rooted to the spot. Before he could respond, she stood up, her posture straightening with quiet dignity. "I'll leave you to it," she said, her voice still calm but now laced with a quiet finality. "But just remember, you don't have to carry it all by yourself." And then she was gone, walking away with a deliberate slowness that made Jackson feel every inch of the distance between them. He sat there, staring after her, his heart still racing, his mind a tangle of conflicting emotions. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to be called out by someone he barely knew. But somehow it was exactly what he needed, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. The bench felt colder now, and Jackson's eyes fell to the scar on his leg. For a brief moment, the weight of his wounds seemed unbearable. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he could keep pretending. The rain had cleared, leaving behind the cool smell of wet earth and the distant hum of cars passing by on the street. Jackson stared straight ahead, his hands resting on his thighs, still holding onto the remnants of the moment with the woman, Mira. He remembered now. Mira. He hadn't expected it, but something about her lingered, an unease that gnawed at him. She had left, but the air between them still felt thick. He tried to shake it off. People came and went all the time. She was just another veteran, another soldier with a limp, with scars. He'd seen enough of them in the years since he'd returned home. Hell, he had his own share of wounds. And yet, there was something about her, about the way she'd looked at him. Not with pity, not with expectation, but with understanding. That quiet confidence had unsettled him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. He heard footsteps again, slower this time, deliberate. He turned his head, hoping it wasn't her, not wanting to face her after that exchange. But it was her. She was walking back toward him, her gait strong but measured. She wasn't rushing to get somewhere. She wasn't in a hurry. She stopped just a few feet from him, her eyes meeting his. A quiet tension filled the space between them, one neither of them seemed willing to break. Jackson tried to avert his gaze, but he couldn't. She didn't look away either. "You're still here," she said softly, her tone unforced, like they were picking up a conversation left unfinished. "I thought you'd have gotten up by now." Jackson's lips parted, but no words came out. What was he supposed to say? He wasn't angry, but he was confused. How did she have the ability to pierce through his defenses so effortlessly? How could she make him feel something without even trying? Instead of answering, he simply shifted slightly on the bench, his body language rigid. He could feel his knee aching, but he ignored it. He didn't want to admit weakness, not to her. Mira didn't seem bothered by his silence. Instead, she sat down next to him again, the same quiet strength in her movements. She placed her hands on her knees, palms up, as if she were trying to release something held too tightly inside. Jackson couldn't help but notice how composed she was. The way she seemed at ease in her own skin, like she didn't need validation from anyone. It made him feel inadequate. His mind raced back to the image of her medal, the one he hadn't let himself acknowledge until now. She wasn't just another soldier. He had seen that medal before, but he'd never once thought he'd be sitting next to someone who had earned it. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse from the tension that still hung in the air. "I didn't mean what I said earlier," he muttered, his words barely escaping, like they were foreign on his tongue. "I've just been through a lot." Mira didn't turn to look at him, but she nodded slightly, as if she understood. "I know what you mean." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jackson could feel the weight of his unspoken words pressing against his chest. He wanted to say more, to tell her about the nightmares that chased him every night, about the faces of the men he couldn't save, about the blood on his hands that wouldn't wash away no matter how hard he tried. But he didn't. He couldn't. Not yet. Mira seemed to sense it, and without a word, she broke the silence. "You know," she began, her voice low but steady, "I wasn't always this calm." Jackson tilted his head, glancing at her quickly, surprised by the shift in tone. This wasn't the person who had dismissed him so effortlessly earlier. There was something else now, a softness beneath her steely exterior that hinted at something deeper, more painful, something real. "I wasn't always so put together either," she continued, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, as if recalling something far off. "I used to be a mess. You wouldn't believe it if you saw me now. When I first came back, I couldn't even walk down a street without feeling like I was choking, like everything was just closing in on me. I'd have to stop, find a bench, and just breathe." Jackson felt a flicker of something inside him, something close to shame but not quite. She was telling him things he hadn't even admitted to himself. The parts of him that still hadn't healed, the parts he kept buried behind walls that were getting higher every day. He had put up those walls for a reason, hadn't he? "You ever feel like that?" she asked, turning her head slightly to look at him. His chest tightened. He didn't want to answer, didn't want to admit that the anxiety, the suffocating weight of everything he had left behind, still clung to him like a second skin. He didn't want to be seen not like this, not so raw. But somehow she had already seen him. He could feel it in her gaze, in the way she didn't look away when he faltered. So he nodded once stiffly. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. All the time. She didn't respond at first. Instead, she let the silence linger, like the spaces between words were as important as the words themselves. Then, almost as if she had been waiting for this moment, she spoke again. "It's okay," she said simply. "You don't have to carry it alone." He looked at her then, really looked at her. Her face was calm, but there was something in her eyes, something deep. She wasn't just talking to him. She was telling him her own story, the things she had carried for so long and had never shared with anyone. The kind of things that couldn't be seen, not by the untrained eye. Her scars were hidden, but they were there, just like his. Her trauma was as real as his. "I wasn't always this calm," she repeated, almost like a mantra, her voice steadier now. "It took me a long time to realize that I didn't have to keep pretending, that I could just be, that I didn't have to force myself to be okay all the time." Jackson's chest constricted as he listened. He was afraid to speak, afraid to break the fragile moment they had found. She was giving him something he hadn't been given in years. The permission to let go, even if just for a second. To stop pretending that he had it all together. He couldn't take it. He needed to say something. Anything. "I don't know how to stop pretending," he admitted, his voice thick. "It's like, I can't. It's easier to just keep going, to just keep fighting." Mira nodded slowly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes held something that Jackson couldn't quite place. Understanding, maybe, or maybe it was empathy, something so rare that he didn't know how to handle it. "I get that," she said softly, "but fighting, sometimes it's not about pushing forward all the time. Sometimes it's about knowing when to rest, when to admit that you're not okay. And that's okay." He could feel the weight of her words sinking in, like stones thrown into the depths of his chest. He didn't know if he was ready for it. He didn't know if he ever would be. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky with a muted palette of oranges and purples. The shadows in the park stretched long across the path, casting everything in a softer, quieter light. Jackson hadn't expected to still be sitting on the bench with Mira when the evening began to settle in. He'd thought he'd brush her off, like he did everyone else. But somehow, here they were, two soldiers, wounded in ways both visible and invisible, bound together by a moment of shared vulnerability. They hadn't said much more after their last conversation. The silence between them had settled like a blanket, comforting in its stillness. But Jackson could feel the weight of everything unsaid lingering. And yet, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel the need to break the silence. He didn't feel the need to prove anything. Mira was still beside him, her posture as calm as ever. But Jackson noticed the way her hands gripped the edges of her jacket, the way her gaze occasionally flicked to the sky as if she were searching for something in it. He had a sense that she was waiting for him to ask more, to push her the way he had pushed others in the past. But he didn't. He wasn't ready. The park was mostly empty now, the occasional jogger or dog walker a distant figure, blurred by the fading light. Jackson's leg ached, but he didn't move to adjust it. The pain felt distant now, almost irrelevant. For the first time in a long while, the pain wasn't the only thing he was aware of. Mira broke the silence first. "You know," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a soft whisper, "there's a reason I came back." Jackson turned his head, surprised by the unexpected shift in her tone. It wasn't forced, but there was something in it that suggested she was finally ready to share a piece of herself. She wasn't just sitting here to fill the air with meaningless words. She had something to say, something that mattered. "I didn't just come back to live a normal life," she continued, her gaze focused on the path in front of her. "I came back to make sure I didn't forget why I fought, why we all fought." Jackson's brow furrowed. His pulse quickened, a sudden unease crawling through his veins. He wasn't sure he was ready to hear whatever it was she was about to tell him. Not after everything that had already been said. But somehow her words had hooked him in. He couldn't look away. He couldn't tune it out. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mira finally turned her head toward him. Her expression was open now, like she wasn't hiding behind the walls that had kept her distant before. He saw something in her eyes that made his throat tighten. Something raw. Something vulnerable. She paused, and Jackson thought she might pull away again. But she didn't. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs as if she were preparing herself for the words to come. "I was awarded the Silver Star," she said, her voice steady but quieter now, like the weight of the words carried more than the medal itself. The name of the medal hit Jackson harder than he expected. His eyes locked onto her chest where the gleam of a small metal bar rested against her jacket. He had recognized it before, of course. He knew what it represented. He had seen the medal worn by others, a symbol of valor, of courage under fire. It was one of the highest honors a soldier could receive. And yet, seeing it on her chest, in the fading light of the evening, felt like a punch to his gut. His mind raced. He stared at the medal, unable to tear his eyes away from it. The weight of it seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. He had heard stories of silver stars, acts of heroism so beyond what most people could comprehend that they seemed unreal. Heroic actions that defied logic. Mira shifted slightly, her eyes studying him, waiting for a reaction. Jackson's mouth felt dry, his mind scrambling for something to say. He had dismissed her earlier, just another soldier. But this was different. The woman sitting next to him wasn't just another vet. She wasn't just another casualty of war. She was someone who had stared death in the face, who had risked everything. He felt the shame rise in his chest, a hot flush creeping up his neck. I didn't know," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. His hands, once so steady, began to tremble. Mira didn't smile, didn't offer any form of sympathy. She just nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. Yeah. Not many do. Jackson clenched his fists, fighting against the swell of emotions he wasn't sure he knew how to handle. He wanted to apologize for how he had dismissed her, for how he had belittled her suffering. But the words didn't come. Instead, he swallowed hard, his throat tightening. I thought you were just another person, you know? Like me. Like everyone else who's been through it. I get it, Mira said, her voice surprisingly gentle, but there was no hint of resentment in it. She wasn't angry with him. She wasn't trying to make him feel bad. Instead, there was something almost forgiving about the way she said it. You weren't wrong, Jackson. We're all soldiers. We're all the same in the end. But the stories are different. Jackson looked at her now, really looked at her. Her face was steady, but her eyes held a depth he hadn't expected. He had seen scars like his before, but he hadn't seen them this way. She wasn't wearing her heroism as a shield. She wasn't parading her courage in front of him for validation. She simply was. I did things over there, she said slowly, her voice becoming quieter, that I'll never be able to forget, that I'll never forgive myself for. But that medal, it's not for me. It's for the men who didn't come home. It's for them. Jackson's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. All the bravado he'd carried with him, all the walls he had built around himself, felt like they were crumbling. In that moment, he realized something he hadn't been willing to admit before. He wasn't the only one who carried the weight of war. Mira wasn't looking for accolades. She wasn't looking for him to praise her or acknowledge her pain. She was simply offering him the truth, her truth. And in doing so, she had shattered something inside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt heavier now, as if the revelation had bound them together in a way words could never explain. Jackson's chest ached, and he could feel the tremor of emotions he had long buried begin to rise. Finally, Mira spoke again, her voice soft but steady. You're not the only one who's been through it, Jackson. You're not the only one with scars that don't show. Her words hung in the air, settling over him like a weight, but also like a release. He didn't know what to say in response. But for the first time, it didn't matter. He didn't need to say anything. He just needed to be there, to sit with it. The park was quiet now. The only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. The last traces of daylight were fading, leaving only the faintest glimmer of twilight. And in that moment, as Mira sat beside him, Jackson finally understood. The night had come, settling around them like a heavy blanket. The park was nearly deserted now, with only the occasional car passing by, its headlights casting long shadows across the concrete path. The evening air had cooled, carrying a sharp bite that made Jackson's breath hang in the air in small, misty clouds. It should have been a comfortable chill, a relief from the heat of the day. But Jackson didn't feel the cold. The weight of what Mira had said, of what he had learned, pressed against him like a physical force, and it was all he could focus on. They had been sitting in silence for what felt like hours, but neither of them moved. Jackson couldn't seem to bring himself to stand, to walk away, even though he wanted to. He wasn't sure if it was because the conversation had unsettled him so much, or because something deeper, something quieter inside him had finally cracked open. Myra's words, her revelation about the silver star, lingered in his mind, still gnawing at him. The way she had said it, as if it meant nothing, as if it was just another piece of the puzzle she had carried for so long. And yet to Jackson it felt like everything. He had lived a life defined by his own trauma, but hearing her speak so plainly about her own pain, about the things she had done and seen, made him realize how much of his own history he had buried. He wasn't ready to confront it. Not yet. Mira, however, seemed to have no such hesitation. She sat there beside him, her presence steady, unwavering. The look in her eyes told Jackson that she wasn't going to let this moment pass without breaking through the walls he had so carefully constructed. And even though he didn't want to, he knew deep down that she was right. He couldn't keep running from it. I didn't ask for the medal, Mira said quietly, her voice cutting through the thick silence between them. I didn't do what I did for recognition. Hell, I didn't even know if I was going to make it out alive. I just acted. Jackson didn't know how to respond. The truth of her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. He had seen medals, heard the stories, but he had never truly understood what it meant to be on the other side of those actions. To be the one who carried the weight of such decisions, such sacrifices, and still had to face each day. "You're right," he muttered after a long pause, his voice barely audible. I never thought about what it takes to do what you did, what it takes to make those choices." Myra's gaze softened, but she didn't say anything. She just watched him, waiting. Jackson shifted uncomfortably on the bench, his leg aching again, but he barely noticed the pain. The real ache was deeper, gnawing at his insides. His throat tightened as the weight of everything he had buried came rushing to the surface, and he couldn't push it back down anymore. He couldn't pretend anymore, not in front of her. "I did things too," he whispered almost to himself. "Things that changed me. Things that I can't take back." His chest tightened. The words had finally escaped him, but now they felt too heavy. He didn't want to say it out loud. He didn't want to admit that his own actions had contributed to the pain he carried. That he wasn't just a victim of war, but a part of the violence. A part of the destruction. He wasn't just someone who had been hurt. He had hurt others. "I was part of a mission," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp. "A mission that went wrong. We were supposed to go in, extract some civilians, and get out. But it didn't go like that. Things got messy. People got hurt. And I froze." Mira didn't interrupt him. She didn't even move. She just listened. Her silence was a lifeline, offering him the space to speak when every instinct screamed at him to stay quiet. "I was supposed to protect them," Jackson continued, his words trembling now. "But I froze. I didn't do what I was supposed to do. And because of that, people died. My team, the civilians, they all died because I couldn't make a choice fast enough." The tears that he had fought so hard to suppress threatened to spill, but Jackson fought them back. He wasn't going to break down. Not here. Not now. He wouldn't give in. "I wasn't a hero, Mira," he whispered. "I wasn't a soldier that day. I was just a scared man. A man who couldn't do what he needed to do." The silence that followed was deafening. Mira still didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jackson could feel her presence beside him, her quiet understanding wrapping around him like a blanket. She wasn't judging him. She wasn't condemning him. She was just there. And for the first time, Jackson felt something in his chest crack. The walls that had kept his pain locked inside began to crumble, just a little. He wasn't ready to confront everything. But in this moment, with Mira beside him, he knew that he had to start. "I've been running from it," he said, his voice thick. "Running from everything I did over there. I thought if I just didn't think about it, it wouldn't matter. But it does, doesn't it?" Myra's voice was quiet when she finally spoke, and the words were gentle but firm. "It does. It matters. All of it matters." Jackson exhaled slowly, his chest tight, his hands trembling. He had spent so many years pretending that the war had left him with nothing but the physical scars. He had told himself that it was the injury to his body that had broken him, not the things he had done, not the choices he had made. But Mira was right. It wasn't just the wounds you could see. It was the ones you carried in silence, the ones that festered deep inside you, the ones that you convinced yourself didn't matter when they mattered more than anything else. "I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for that," Jackson said, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can ever be okay with it." "You don't have to be okay with it," Mira replied, her voice soft but resolute. "Not yet, but you can start by facing it. You can start by letting go of the idea that you're alone in it. We all carry those things, Jackson. Every one of us. But the only way to stop it from eating you alive is to stop pretending it doesn't exist." Jackson's breath hitched in his chest as her words sank in. She was telling him what he had needed to hear for so long. He didn't have to forgive himself right away. He didn't have to be a hero. He didn't have to be anything but what he was. A man who had suffered, who had hurt, and who was trying to make sense of it all. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. He let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging as the weight of it all settled inside him. He didn't feel better, not yet. But for the first time in a long time he felt something else, something fragile but real. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could start to heal. The night deepened around them, the air cool with the quiet promise of autumn. Jackson sat on the bench, still in the same spot where everything had unfolded, where his past, his regrets, and his pain had spilled out in ways he hadn't been prepared for. The park was almost empty now. The remaining few people had trickled away into the shadows, leaving only the distant hum of city life in the background. It was strange how easily everything could slip away, how silence could consume you in ways words never could. Mira remained seated beside him, but the space between them had shifted. No longer was it an uncomfortable silence, a space defined by walls and distrust. Now it felt different, like a fragile understanding had formed between them, something that existed beyond the necessity of words. She had been patient, giving him the time and space to speak when he was ready, to share his truth. And when he did, she had listened with no judgment, only empathy, only strength. Jackson wasn't sure what had changed in him during the hours they'd spent together, but something had. The suffocating weight of his own guilt, his own shame, no longer felt like an anchor dragging him under. He still wasn't sure how to fix the pieces of himself that had broken, how to make sense of the mess he had become. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was alone in it. Mira shifted slightly, her posture still calm, still collected. She hadn't spoken much since he had opened up, but she didn't need to. Jackson could feel the shift within her too, the unspoken understanding that sometimes silence was more meaningful than anything else. The world around them had quieted, but Jackson's mind was still running, still reeling from everything he had confessed. He had never allowed himself to be vulnerable like that, never allowed anyone to see the cracks, the parts of him that weren't strong, weren't fixed. But Mira had seen them, and instead of turning away, she had sat with him. She hadn't offered easy solutions or empty words of comfort. She had simply let him be. "Do you ever think it will get easier?" Jackson asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last remnants of daylight were fading. His question wasn't about the pain of war. It wasn't even about the metal or the ghosts of the battlefield. It was about life, about moving forward. Mira didn't answer right away. She let the question hang in the air, like the weight of it was still being measured. Then softly she spoke. "I think it gets different," she said, her tone quiet but resolute. "It doesn't go away. I don't think it's supposed to. But you learn to carry it with you, rather than letting it carry you." Jackson let the words settle in his chest, feeling the truth of them resonate deep within him. He had spent so many years running from the past, hiding from it, thinking that if he could just push it down far enough, it would disappear. But it never did. It never would. Mira turned toward him, her eyes calm, steady. "The trick is learning how to keep moving forward, even when the past is always with you. It's not about forgetting. It's about making peace with the fact that it's a part of who you are. And then, you live anyway." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that Jackson wasn't sure he had the strength to bear. They were about acceptance, not resolution. About facing what you had done, what you had lost, and still choosing to move through the world with your head held high. Jackson swallowed hard, his throat tight. For the first time in what felt like years, he felt a flicker of hope, small, almost fragile, but it was there. The idea that he didn't have to be broken forever, that he could move forward without the burden of perfection, that it was okay to still be scarred, still be hurt, and still have the strength to keep going. He looked at Mira, really looked at her for the first time. She wasn't some distant figure with a medal on her chest. She was a person, a woman who had faced the same horrors, the same darkness, and had come out on the other side. Not unscathed, but whole in her own way. She wasn't trying to fix him, wasn't trying to give him answers. She was simply showing him that it was possible to keep moving, even with the weight of the past on your shoulders. "Thank you," Jackson said, his voice barely audible. He wasn't sure what he was thanking her for listening, for understanding, for simply being there. But the words felt right, even if they weren't enough to express everything he felt. Mira gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, her eyes softening. "You don't have to thank me," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm not here to fix you. I'm just here to remind you that you're still breathing. And that's enough." Jackson nodded, a strange lump forming in his throat. He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her just how much her words had meant, how much her presence had changed him in these quiet moments. But he didn't know how. He didn't have the words. So instead, he let the silence stretch between them, comfortable now, filled with unspoken understanding. Mira stood up slowly, the quiet grace in her movements never faltering. She adjusted her jacket, her eyes meeting his one last time. "I've got to go," she said, her voice still steady but with a trace of finality. "But take care of yourself, Jackson. And remember, it's okay to not have it all figured out." Jackson watched as she turned and started to walk away, her steps purposeful, her silhouette becoming smaller in the dimming light. He wanted to call after her, to ask her to stay, to tell her that maybe, just maybe, he could be okay. But he didn't. He simply watched her go, her figure fading into the shadows of the park. For the first time, he didn't feel abandoned. He didn't feel alone. Because in that moment, he realized something. He wasn't expected to carry the weight of his past alone. He didn't have to be the only one holding himself up. There were others who had walked the same path, others who had carried the same scars. And in that understanding, there was a quiet kind of peace. Jackson stood up slowly, his body stiff from hours of sitting, but there was something different in the way he moved now. The ache in his knee was still there, but it didn't matter as much. The weight of his own history still pressed against him, but it didn't feel as suffocating. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. The park was empty now, save for the distant hum of the city. Jackson walked away, slowly at first, but with each step, he felt the weight of the past. Not disappearing, not vanishing, but shifting. And as he walked, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to have it all figured out. Maybe the journey was enough. And for the first time, it didn't feel like he was carrying it alone.